What's up, 49ers faithful? We are back with another episode of the 49ers Web Zone Huddle podcast, and we got a fun one for y'all today. And this, for me, is awesome because I have been a lifelong fan of Paul Lucas's work, and I've been a lifelong fan of UniWatch. So we have the man himself. We have UniWatch. We have Paul Lucas joining the show today. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for inviting me and having me on. And, you say you're a lifelong UniWatch fan. I am a lifelong 49ers fan. So for all the teams to be invited onto a podcast, this is the one I'm most excited about. And, I live out on the East Coast. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. There are not a lot of Niners fans here, but there's me at least.
There you go. Holding it down for the Eastern Seaboard, right?
Yeah. It's funny. People often ask me, why would you be a 49ers fan? I grew up on Long Island. I'm a lifelong New York State resident. But when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I reached into a box of cornflakes and pulled out, they had like giveaway trading cards. And the first one I pulled out was a Ken Willard card. He was a running back for the 49ers at that time.
Hey.
And from that very moment, he became my favorite player and the 49ers became my favorite team. And, there were some rough, I'm a little older than you. There were some rough periods in the 70s. The Niners were 2-14, 2 years in a row, which kind of tested my fandom a little bit. But it was right after that they drafted Joe Montana and things started turning around. And of course, we're here to talk about uniforms. I'm really lucky that the team I ended up rooting for has generally been a very good-looking team over the years. The Niners uniforms have, for the most part, been very, very solid.
Yeah, I would say so as well. It's, obviously we're biased here. We're all Niners fans here. And I feel like right now it's the cleanest uniform set in the league. And you combine the actual current uniforms, which is a nod to the 1980s uniforms with the gray face mask and the red, the cherry red jersey and the gold pants. And you combine that with the throwbacks, the 94 throwbacks, which are actually the throwbacks from the 50s
Right.
that they wore in that 94 season.
I think the first throwback to a throwback.
Right. And what people may not know is that Eddie DeBartolo in 1994, Eddie DeBartolo actually paid a fine for the 49ers wearing those throwback uniforms all season. Like, he was getting fined for that because the deal was that they would only wear it for a certain amount of games. Am I correct on that?
I never heard that it was a fine situation. I know he did ask for permission, at least, and that they ended up wearing them more often than was originally planned. And that was 1994. It was when all the NFL teams wore throwbacks to celebrate the league's 75th anniversary or diamond anniversary. And most teams did it for just 2 games, 3 games. I think a couple of teams did it for only 1 game. But DeBartolo did like the throwbacks and asked for permission. The Niners were on a run. Also, they were sort of on a roll that season, and he just it was sort of like a superstition thing. Let's keep wearing them. And then they asked for permission to keep wearing them in the postseason. And I know they did get permission for that, and they wore them all the way through the Super Bowl, where they defeated the Chargers in that Super Bowl.
And I believe to this day, they're the only team to actually wear like a throwback uniform in the Super Bowl, not counting the teams that were actually like the throwback teams back in the early days.
Right. Yeah, I believe that is correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's super cool. I've actually got a 75th anniversary Jerry Rice jersey, like the authentic one, hanging in my closet. I just bought it a few months ago when it came available. And that to me is the uniform that I grew up on, right? Like I remember they only wore it for a season, but it's near and dear to my heart because they won that last Super Bowl that I remember in that uniform. But what to you, what is the worst 49ers uniform if they have one, which is the one that you were like, hey, that's kind of the ugly stepchild of the group?
That's a really easy one because it's that black alternate they wore 5 or 6 years ago, and that was just a disaster. I remember writing a piece where I said my favorite team and I need to have a little talk here, because the whole what we at UniWatch call BFBS, which is black for black's sake, when you just black isn't one of your team colors, but you just roll out a black alternate uniform because it looks cool or it looks intimidating or some nonsense like that. And I really thought the 49ers were kind of above that. There were certain teams that, are prone to kind of gimmicky uniform and marketing initiatives. And then there are teams that are not, that kind of play it straight. And I always kind of put the 49ers in the latter category. Like they were not one of the teams that kind of just did this gratuitous marketing stuff. But they did do that black uniform, and man, it was just awful. As a Niners fan, I was embarrassed. I really was.
Yeah. It was, the numbers were hard to read.
That too. Yeah. It wasn't even functional as a piece of design, like, because it was hard. There wasn't enough contrast on the numbers, because they could have put white outlining on the red numbers. That would have helped a little. Still would have been an awful uniform, but at least it would have been functional.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm just so glad that one's been mothballed. And that as soon as I saw it, I was like, all right, so this is going to be on all those what were they thinking lists years from now.
And I think that we also have to remember what the team was going through at that time. That was right after they fired Jim Harbaugh. The team was in turmoil. They needed to create some excitement. The fans it was borderline fan mutiny. That was the year that they were flying banners above the stadium. So I think that the ownership group, they wanted to kind of get the fans' minds off of the on-field product by changing what the on-field product looked like. But they executed horribly on that for a number of reasons, the reasons that we discussed, but also the socks didn't match. They were wearing like the normal red socks. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, they had the gold helmet. Like if you're going black, you have to go like all black, right? It just has to be all black.
Dude, don't give them any ideas. Don't give them.
Right.
The last thing we want is for them to say, you know what, that old black uniform didn't work, but now that we can add a second helmet, let's not give Nike or the Niners any ideas.
That's right. I retract my statement. I absolutely retract my statement. But I think universally amongst 49ers fans, I think they'll agree is that's the worst one. Another one that I feel like doesn't get a fair shake, that was a good one at the time, because I remember that they changed it because we had seen gray face masks forever for the 49ers, was in 1996 when they brought in the new uniform change, where they had the red face mask and they had the two different size numbers for the home and away jerseys, and like the shoulder patch numbers were different sizes than like the chest. It was not executed poorly, but I do give them credit for changing it up. They had the white pants.
That uniform had some potential. It had like the black drop shadow on the numbers, and they changed the helmet striping. They put some black trim on the helmet striping and the pants striping. But it always felt just a little too big. It wasn't terrible, but like for instance, they had the SF logo, the same one that appears on the helmet. It was on the sleeves and it was on the hips, I believe, of the pants. And it was just too much. Like, you don't need to put the SF logo on every single part of the uniform, like the helmet and the jersey and the pants. It was just overkill. And I felt like everything about that uniform just felt like a little too much. Like they were just pushing it a little too much. And it wasn't awful, but I was happy when they went back to like the classic, like 70s and 80s style.
Yeah, likewise. I think that to me is indicative of the golden years of the 49ers dynasty of the 80s and partially the 70s as well, like you mentioned. That thick stripe down the pant side, like the three stripe, but now it's much thinner now, but just having that there, like, it was iconic. The three stripes on the jersey sleeves, they went to two recently, they went back to three now. After they changed the saloon font, they changed the font as well. They got away from the saloon font. Like, I mean, that was just egregious. That they listened to the fans, so I give them credit, because we wanted the saloon font back after they started doing like the throwback games in 2019. But that font was just so bad that with the underline of the ERS, the 49ers.
Yeah, that was like an old 60s logo that they had used. I mean, it was part of the team's history and heritage, but the saloon font obviously is also and is something that I think fans connect with a lot more. And I agree that it looks better there.
Yeah, and I feel like that 96 uniform, which they eventually paired with gold pants in 98. I feel like 96, 97, when they had the all white uniform, it was a good look. And I feel like that's something that they could have gone forward with as maybe an alternate if the NFL allowed that. But I also feel like those years, they felt like maybe they were getting away from what the actual roots of what they were. So they added the gold pants back in 98. And I vividly remember that season as well. That's the catch two, Terrell Owens in the wild card game against Green Bay. And I feel like those uniforms in particular with the red face mask and the gold pants, a lot of people don't appreciate those enough because after that year, Steve Young gets hurt in early 1999, and they're basically mediocre for the next half decade at that point because they're going through coaches like crazy. Jeff Garcia came in and he had a small
They're going through coaches and quarterbacks.
exactly. So, and I feel like that uniform doesn't get a good shake because you'll see oftentimes on Twitter or X now where people will post uniform concepts and they'll post that uniform and there's like a visceral like negative reaction to that uniform because I feel like the era that it represents.
Yeah, I think it was sort of a transitional era, and therefore that is seen as a transitional uniform, which I think in retrospect it is a transitional uniform, but it again, it's not terrible. I feel like again, as a Niners fan, I've been really lucky to have a team that I root for that generally, those black uniforms notwithstanding, generally looks pretty good out there week after week.
So if I were to ask you one 49ers player, because I'm also big on player aesthetics, like the gear that they wear and how they wear it. Like in high school, like I emulated like Ricky Waters and Deion Sanders in terms of like the gear that they wore because it was just so cool to me. So for me, like I feel like Deion Sanders and Ricky Waters are the two guys that I grew up on, like, and they just had the best aesthetic to me. I was a receiver and DB, so for me it was like that worked. But if there's one player you can point out in 49ers history that had that aesthetic that you looked at like, hey, that he looks really good in that uniform, who would it be?
That's tough. There's a lot. I can think of a lot of players. One who comes to mind is Roger Craig, running back, who had this sort of high stepping running style. It often looked like he was almost going to like come out of his socks. And he just, the uniform looked good on him. I even liked the way he wore his eye black because he would wear eye black on the field, and it had. I mean, it sounds silly to say, but it looked like it was smudged just right, if that's possible. Right. And a few other players. Obviously, I loved watching Joe Montana and just the. It's not always just the uniform. It's like the posture of the player. Like when Joe Montana threw a quarterback, he would raise his arms like in a touchdown symbol, and he couldn't, like any player, he couldn't put them straight up because his shoulder pads got in the way, right? Yeah. But there was this sort of exultation and this sense of like joy and success and yes in the way he carried himself out there, and I always liked that. And not another lucky thing about rooting for the Niners is that they've had a lot of success over the years, and people look pretty good when they're winning, right?
Of course.
They carry them. No, seriously, they carry themselves well. There's like a posture and like a kind of skip in their step and a chip on their shoulder, maybe. And there's just, the Niners have often had that because they've been a successful team, and so the players have looked good out there. I can think of one player who I didn't like how he wore the uniform, although I loved him as a player, and that was Frank Gore, who I read has just returned to the Niners front office like this past week, I think, in some kind of front office role. But Frank Gore, throughout his career, not just with the Niners, had a thing for really short pants, like biker pants, kind of. And I imagine he was fined for it from time to time. But he didn't care. Like it was just what was comfortable for him. And so some players who go with those shorter biker style pants, they'll wear longer socks or like tights or leggings to make up for it. So they still don't have any exposed skin. But Gore didn't do that. He had the shorter pants and just regular socks that like stopped a little below the kneecap. And so his knees and his kind of lower thigh were always exposed. And often, because he's a running back and it's rough and tumble out there, his socks would get pulled down, like, he was being tackled or he's blocking or whatever. And he didn't always bother to pull them back up. So he'd be out there and he'd have these really short biker style pants and then basically bare-legged below that, and it looked very like NCAA. It was very college football look, because in college, not all the college teams wear socks. That's not a requirement in the NCAA the way it is in the NFL. And I always thought, yeah, that's not really a good NFL look. That's not really a good 49ers look. But Frank Gore going to be, if he's not already, he's going to be a Hall of Famer. And it's hard to argue about, with how he chose to wear his uniform. It was just what he felt comfortable with as he went about his business.
I feel very much the same way about socks in general. Like when I played, like I always wore socks and they were always high, and it just looked more complete. The uniform just looks complete, right? By having either a solid colored set of socks, or like the NFL socks we have like the half color, half white. And there have been guys who they'll wear like the ankle socks with like tights, and it'll still match. There's guys that wear just the tights and no socks. There's Color Rush, which is basically just a large like unitard for most teams. And now there's been several teams that have come out with variations of uniforms. I feel like this particular summer has been one of the best I've ever seen in terms of releasing throwbacks that we've always wanted to be re-released. And
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the ones I'm particularly talking about are the Eagles Kelly Greens, the Creamsicle Buccaneers, the Seattle Seahawks from the 90s, and obviously the old Houston Oilers throwbacks for the Titans. Like those four for me, and there's others. There's the Vikings that released theirs, and the Falcons were wearing uniforms as well. And there's redesigns with the Colts and the Cardinals, but those first four for me were like, that was like my childhood. Like I loved all of those uniforms. And although I hate the Seahawks, I love that uniform. It's fantastic.
I do too. In fact, when I stopped what I was working on to take this call and do this call with you, I was actually working on my upcoming NFL season preview, which will run shortly before the regular season starts. And I was actually writing. I was in the Seahawks section of that piece, and I was writing how happy I am to see that uniform back. Because man, I always love that. It's green and blue don't always work together in the world in general, but it's really rare you see it. It's not a common sports color combo. It's certainly not a common NFL color combo. But I always love that uniform with the Seahawks. I love it so much more than what they wear now. And for me, like seeing that again was like an old friend when they did the unveiling. And we should say here, probably most of your listeners already know, but the reason there are so many throwbacks and alternates being released this summer is that from 2013 through last year, the NFL had what was called the one shell rule, which was a rule that said teams could only have one helmet color. You could change the way that one helmet color was decorated. And so for some teams, they could like swap out the decals and the striping tape and create a different helmet design, like a throwback helmet design. In some cases, like the Dolphins have been doing that for years, for example. They just use their white primary helmet and turn it into a white throwback helmet. But for a lot of teams, their throwback look required a different helmet color, and they weren't able to do it while the one shell rule was in effect. The rule was lifted last year. We saw a few new throwbacks, but there were some supply chain issues in the NFL, like in so much the rest of the world because of the pandemic. This year, though, it's like the dam burst, and we're seeing so many new throwbacks, so many new alternate helmets because of the lifting of that rule, including all the ones you're talking about. The Eagles couldn't do their Kelly Greens because they had the midnight green shell. Buccaneers couldn't do their creamsicle throwbacks because they normally have the pewter shell. Now they can bring back the white helmet and slap Bucko Bruce on there. And that uniform, the creamsicles, is so interesting because it was really laughed at for so many years in the 70s and 80s, in part because the Buccaneers themselves were so bad, right? Like their first season in 1976, they went 0-14, the first modern NFL team to go winless in a full season. And generally speaking, they were not a good team during the creamsicle or Bucko Bruce era. But there's been a certain nostalgia, or I like to call it a reputational renaissance for that uniform. And I think part of it is that the Bucs have worn some bad uniforms over the years, like those what was called the alarm clock jerseys, with that weird, that digital looking font. And honestly, I'm not a huge fan of their current primary uniforms either, even though I know they've won Super Bowl in them. And, it's not terrible. And they certainly own that pewter color. There's nothing else like it in the NFL. But I have to say, I have a soft spot for the creamsicles, and I'm going to be happy to see that back on the field this season.
So when NFL Network did used to do their top tens, you remember this, back in the early 2010s, and they would look at uniforms, top 10 worst uniforms. The Buccaneers were on that, and the Creamsicles were on that, and they were on that list, and they were just talking about a lot of the talking points that you just mentioned, where it represented an era of a futility for that team, and Boca Bruce is like winking on the logo, and it's like a non-threatening sort of thing.
He was almost like the last of that kind of mascot character or logo character, where he didn't look intimidating. He, like, the guy who designed him said he was trying to make him look like Errol Flynn, like the old swashbuckling movie star. Well, by the 70s, I don't know how many NFL fans, especially young NFL fans, even knew who Errol Flynn was. And certainly by the 90s, which is when 97 is when they swapped out the creamsicles for the pewter uniforms. Certainly, I think the vast majority of NFL fans couldn't even tell you who Errol Flynn was. And it was just sort of it felt not even like a good nostalgia, but just like it would be like the equivalent of like having a marching band play like the pop hits of the 50s before the game, instead of the way an NFL pregame situation looks and sounds now. It just didn't feel modern. It just felt kind of lost in time. And yeah, certainly didn't look intimidating, or it just didn't feel very sportsy. But again, I gotta say, I'm kind of glad to see it back. And certainly, there were people who said the orange color also, because there had never been that shade of orange. The Bengals and Browns wear orange, but it's a much deeper, richer, more saturated orange, whereas the Bucks use a lighter shade. And people were saying it looked kind of wimpy, or it just didn't. But it was very, I thought, very Florida, right? Like, that's the color of like Florida orange juice, and
Totally.
it's just the Sunshine State. And so I always thought it was very appropriate in that sense, and I didn't have a problem with it color wise. But I do think the team's on-field struggles in terms of just wins and losses didn't do the people's assessment of that uniform any favors.
I just the other night, it's funny, I used to do this when I was a kid, but just the other night, because I like doing this just because you don't see it in the NFL in real life. I played Madden, and I had the Buccaneers versus the Tennessee Titans, and they're both in their throwback home uniforms, because you'll never see that, right? Aside from Color Rush. So,
right. So you set up a color versus color game with orange versus Columbia blue.
Yes, exactly. And it looks
that
so
would
good.
Great. That would be.
It was awesome. And like, I wish the NFL would let them do this. Like that Oilers throwback. That was the one I was looking most forward to, because I love those uniforms. I love that. It reminds me of Warren Moon and the 90s Oilers before they moved to Tennessee. And even Stephen McNair wore that for a year, right? Or a couple of years before they became the Titans when they were playing Vanderbilt. But man, it was that one was the one I was kind of waiting for. The Buccaneers one is awesome, but they dropped that like a couple of years ago as well. They've worn that when Josh Freeman was the quarterback. They were wearing that. But the Oilers uniforms, aside from the AFL drops that they do every once in a while, we haven't seen that particular iteration of the uniform with the red face mask and the red outline numbers and stuff. We haven't seen that since basically the 90s.
Right. Yeah, I'm excited for that one too. It's sort of a controversial move on their part in the uniform world, because some people feel it's disrespectful to Houston. Like, the team packed up and left Houston, but they took the intellectual property in terms of the team name and the team colors and all the iconography with them. And they did play as the Tennessee Oilers for 2 years, as you say. But a lot of people think, I'm sort of two minds about this, but many fans think it's sort of like rubbing salt in the wound for Houston fans, for them to be reviving that uniform. And in fact, they're going to be wearing it against the Houston Texans. So it's going to be sort of a Houston versus Houston game in Tennessee, which is kind of sticking it a little, some people think. But I understand that point of view. I'm sympathetic to that point of view. At the same time, I think franchise through lines and franchise histories are really interesting. And it's like interesting to know that the Titans used to be the Oilers, and like to follow teams, from their different cities and different identities and all that. I really like sports history, and I like knowing where teams and brands came from. And so I kind of like that when you bring a throwback back into circulation. It's sort of like a history lesson, and I kind of dig that.
Mhm.
And then also, yes, it looks really good. That Oilers uniform looks really, really good, and I am very stoked to see it. That's another really unique color combo, the Columbia blue and the red. There's nothing else like it in NFL history, and I'm very excited to see it back on the field. And it doesn't hurt also that I'm not really a big fan of the Titans' current uniforms. So every time they are wearing an Oilers throwback, that's one less game that they're wearing their primary uniforms, which I see as like addition by subtraction, if you know what I mean.
Right, the flaming thumbtacks, right?
Yeah,
Flaming
yeah,
thumbtacks,
yeah.
there, yeah. So there's a couple of teams that released icy whites as well. So the Cleveland Browns released the white alternate uniform with the white helmet, and the Denver Broncos released icy white helmets to go with their alternate uniform as well. I feel like the latter was a miss because they've got the old Denver Broncos logo that we all love, but they put it on a white helmet when they could have just released the blue helmet and re-released the Orange Crush uniforms, which is what I feel like the people really want.
I basically agree with everything you just said. I think the Broncos white helmet, and we should say here for your listeners who may not know, the rule in the NFL is that an alternate, at least for now, is that an alternate helmet can be worn only with an alternate uniform. So the Broncos solid orange color rush uniform is the only thing available for this new white helmet to be paired with. So they had worn a navy helmet with the old D logo with that orange color rush uniform. Now they're going to wear this new. Yeah, that wasn't bad actually. But now they're going to wear this new white helmet. And I got to say, it's not a terrible looking uniform. The white helmet, orange jersey, orange pants, but it doesn't feel like the Broncos to me. I don't think it's not necessarily a bad uniform, but I think it's a bad Broncos uniform. It feels, in part because of the orange over orange, it feels more collegiate, more NCAA to me. And then when you have something like a white helmet, orange jersey, I'm thinking like Oklahoma State or something like that. It just does not feel like the Broncos to me. So it's not like ugly, but it doesn't feel like the right move, especially when, as you point out, they could have gone with the royal blue helmet. And I think that would have been a much better move. Just the pure throwback helmet, even if they didn't bring back the full Orange Crush uniform, just wear the royal blue helmet with this existing orange on orange color rush uniform. And I think that would have been a big hit. But they clearly have some like more moves in the works. This is just the first move of a makeover for the Broncos. They have made it clear that they're going to be overhauling their primary uniforms, which have now been with us, since 1997. So it's a long time. And they have new ownership, so they've had to sort that out. Like what does ownership want to do in terms of what, it's not just the existing owners saying, oh, let's change things up. This is the new owner's chance to kind of put their imprint on the team, their visual stamp on the team. And then also they know that a lot of fans want to go back to the old Orange Crush. So they haven't committed yet to a new look coming next season. But it's clearly going to be either next season or the year after. They're going to have a whole new look, and I wouldn't be surprised if an Orange Crush throwback is part of it.
I would love to see that. I would absolutely love to see that. It's such a great uniform, and
it really is. Yeah. The original Orange Crush, yeah,
totally. And it's funny because that Broncos uniform that they're trying to get away from, they recently became like a one color sort of uniform. What people may not remember is that when they released those in 97 in the preseason, they actually were one color, right? They were all blue.
They wore navy over navy, and that for preseason. But John Elway said he didn't like it.
Exactly. I was going to get to that. Yeah, John Elway didn't like that, and then they went up going with the all whites with one color, and then having the white pants and the home uniforms, ended up winning 2 Super Bowls in those uniforms, and became iconic for that period of time. And it's just funny how that happens. I remember the Eagles also tried this as well the same season. It was actually against the 49ers. It was the first time I had ever seen a team go home solid on solid. And they were playing in Philadelphia. It was a primetime game. And Dennis Stubblefield had like 3 or 4 sacks in that game. He was unreal in that game. And the Niners won. But I remember seeing the Eagles in all green, all green uniforms, and how strange that was, because you just never saw that. You just saw you would see, white pants or gray pants with the solid color on top. And now it's just commonplace in the NFL.
Yeah, I think the Bills really made that like a mainstream thing. In I believe it was 2002, they changed from their Jim Kelly era uniforms to the darker navy blue.
with the shoulder
And
panels and stuff.
yeah, yeah, with the like the piping around the shoulder yoke and all of that.
Yeah.
And for their first game that season, their home opener and season opener, they wore the navy over white, which is sort of what you'd expect. And then
Mhm.
for the rest of the season, all their home games, their other 7 home games, they wore navy over navy. And in fact, for the rest of that uniform's existence, which was 2002 through 2010, they introduced their current set in 2011. But from '02 to 10, they wore navy over navy, or the solid color or monochromatic, whatever you want to call it, for at least 6 and sometimes 7 of their 8 home games in every one of those seasons. And I think they are really the team that normalized that. They, and I guess the Seahawks also, because the Seahawks
Right.
in that late '90s period were also doing that. And both the Seahawks and the Bills, people started calling it the scuba look, because it looked like in both cases it was like a dark blue, and it looked like a scuba suit.
Yeah, I feel like now that the league in general is going back to what made them great. All these uniforms have so much personality. The classic looks aren't changing. Obviously, the Steelers, Packers, Cowboys, those looks are the Bears. Those looks are staying the same, and those are like flagship classic looks for the NFL. But then you have teams that have several alternate uniforms, like the Buccaneers did at one point, with that terrible digital clock font and the huge logo on the helmet. It was
Yeah, the
weird.
oversized logo. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like they're getting back to what made them great. And there's some teams that have misses. The Colts have released a weird black alternate uniform with horizontal shoulder stripes on the top and a black helmet. The Detroit Lions released a new blue helmet, which I kind of like because I'm a car guy as well, and I understand the heritage. But they released a new blue helmet to go with the gray unitard for some reason, which is to me one of the worst uniforms in the NFL.
Yeah,
And
and you mentioned you're a car fan, and so you're saying you like that blue Lions helmet because it's based on the Mustang logo, the logo,
exactly, I'm a Mustang guy,
blue
right?
helmet.
So yeah,
Yeah, the walking lion with the 2 stripes in the background, and so
yeah,
that's the lion that's based on the Ford Mustang. Lions, of course, are owned by the Ford family, so maybe a little cross pollination there. And I agree. I think that solid gray Lions uniform is really probably the worst uniform in the league right now. But they somehow found a way to make it worse, because as bad as it was with the silver helmet, I think it looks even worse with this new blue helmet. And I don't think the blue helmet by itself, viewed in a vacuum, is a terrible design, but it just
mhm,
doesn't work on that. Well, nothing's going to work on that solid gray uniform. And again, they are sort of hemmed in by this rule that says if you have an alternate helmet, it can be worn only with an alternate uniform. So they can't wear that new blue helmet with their primary blue jersey. They can't play mix and match that way. They have to wear it only with the alternate, and the alternate happens to be the awful gray uniform. And yeah, it really seems like a waste. Like they created this like not terrible helmet, but they're sort of constrained it in terms of what they can do with it, and it really doesn't work.
yeah. There's teams that there's over engineering going on, and I know we're up against it a little bit, so we'll wrap here. But there's teams that have over engineered. I feel like the Jets, they did bring back the New York Sack Exchange uniforms,
Yes,
which is great.
that's another throwback you didn't mention, the Jets throwbacks. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which
they brought those back.
honestly, I'm not a huge fan of the Sack Exchange era, because I like the sort of Joe Namath era,
Right.
or then Bill Parcells when he took over the Jets, he brought that back, like the Vinny Testaverde era of
Mhm.
that design for the Jets. Uh, but the Sack Exchange is certainly so much better than the Jets' current primary uniform, which just looks like an Arena League team. I'm here in New York, so I know a lot of Jets fans and everything. I'm embarrassed by it. I really am. I think it's just cringeworthy. So yeah, at least for 2 games this year, we won't have to look at that. It's another case of addition by subtraction, because they'll be wearing those Sack Exchange throwbacks. I thought it was interesting actually that they chose to do a white jersey for the Sack Exchange throwback
Right.
rather than the
Yeah.
green. The Jets did wear white at home for a period in there, like back in the day in the Sack Exchange era, but not for the whole time. And it's a little weird that they, the team's nickname is Gang Green, and they're not wearing green. I think they wore their green jersey, primary jersey, only once last season, just once.
Right.
And here they are. They have a chance to get in on the whole nostalgia thing, throwback, blah blah blah, and they go with the white, and it'll be white over white. It's not terrible, but you'd think the green over white would look a little more dynamic. I am surprised by that.
And there's other teams as well that are kind of just teasing us, right, with what they should release, but they're not really releasing. The Falcons is one of them. I love that all red Falcons uniform. They keep releasing the helmet. Give me the whole thing. Like, give me the whole uniform. Like,
yeah.
And I will never understand the obsession of teams writing their city name on like their home uniforms. I will never understand that. Like, we know where you're from. We're in your home city. It's just.
Are you saying they should have the team name, or that there shouldn't be anything there?
There should be anything. Well, they'll have the city name. Like Cleveland did that, right? The Browns did that,
right?
And those were awful. And they're wearing those at home, and it's like, we know where you're from. Like, you're in Cleveland.
I think a lot of that, the whole trend of having the city name or the team name on the chest of the jersey, really started because of jersey sales. Like if you go back to a period when you couldn't go to Modell's or wherever, or online Fanatics, and buy a jersey. A lot of time, a football jersey, unlike most other sports, it's a pretty plain garment in the classic sense. It's like a colored shirt with a big number on it, right? And maybe some stripes, and it doesn't have like a script like in baseball or in basketball. It doesn't have like a big logo crest like in hockey. It's just got a number. And I think a lot of fans or teams figured out or tried to see if fans, and I think they were right, would prefer to have a jersey that literally says something. Like if you're wearing it, you're saying and projecting and telling people, like, I'm a Cleveland fan, or I'm a Bengals fan, or whatever it might be. And one thing about all these throwbacks we're seeing, they do not have anything in that spot. All these throwback jerseys that we've been talking about, because they are from an era when jersey sales, merchandise, retail sales were not the same as they are now, and teams didn't put anything in that spot because fans weren't buying jerseys. And so, right. Yeah, it's an interesting difference in that era to the current era.
And man, I could literally talk to you for hours about that. I love uniform talk. I love jersey talk. This has been so awesome. But we do have to wrap here. But I will close by saying one thing about the 49ers uniform, circling back to that full circle. I feel like one thing that they could do to improve it, I don't think there should be a refresh of the uniforms. I feel like this is a classic look. They nailed it. The fans love it. It's really, really great. I feel like the one thing that they could do to improve it just a little bit more is removing the black from the logo and just going back to the, just the old logo that they used to have. And I understand why they do
that, the helmet logo.
Correct. Yeah. Removing the black.
Yeah. So that you like the throwback version, which is almost the same as the primary version, but it doesn't have that little black trim around it.
Yeah, and there's a little gold trim as well on the inside of the black too.
Yeah, right? There's like a layer. Yeah.
Yeah, to remove that and just go like straight to the throwback, because they're really close to those uniforms, anyways.
Yep, you are old school. You want it like exactly the old version. I like both. I gotta say, I wouldn't argue with you. I feel like I've internalized the black as sort of, yeah, I can live with it. If that's the biggest change they're making from like the classic design I grew up with, I can live with that. But yeah, would it be nice to see them strip that little layer of black away? Yeah, it would be. I'm with you there. But it's that's not a hill I'm going to die on. Let's put it that way.
We're splitting hairs here, right? So. Well, Paul Lukas, thank you so much. You are the man when it comes to cloth talk, uniform talk. You are the primary source. You are the man. You've been doing this for years. You are a pillar in this in this discussion area, and it's been so great to talk to you. It's kind of a surreal experience for me, reading your stuff for years and looking at your articles. Like, what? I agree with that. That's actually a really good point. And back from my college days up till now my adulthood, it's been awesome. And please tell everybody where they can find your work.
So people, they can read the daily UniWatch blog at uni-watch.com. That's uni-watch.com. And then also I have a weekly Substack where I do longer feature-length pieces. You can get sort of a sneak peek at them for free. You have to subscribe, become a paid subscriber to read the full thing. Personally, I think it's kind of worth it, but I'm maybe a little biased. And you can see that at paullukas.substack.com. That's Paul Lukas, Lukas, so all one word, PAULLUKAS.substack.com.
Awesome stuff. So again, thank you so much to the great Paul Lukas for joining the 49ers Web Zone No Huddle podcast. And we will see you next time on the Odyssey Network. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.